In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where 1,000 different species have formed the most powerful alliance in known history, there exists a simple truth that every alien civilization has learned to accept: humans are soft, weak, and hopelessly naive. They have no natural weapons, no thick hides, no venomous fangs. They cannot breathe methane like the Corathians, survive in vacuum like the crystalline Zephyrite, or regenerate lost limbs like the aquatic Merlati. By every measurable standard of galactic civilization, humans should have been extinct long before they ever reached the stars. Yet here they are, scattered across hundreds of worlds, serving as diplomats, engineers, farmers, and, most puzzling of all, protectors. Princess Zarahai of the Veltar Empire has studied these peculiar creatures for years, and she's convinced she understands them perfectly. Humans, she believes, survive through a combination of luck, advanced technology gifted by more advanced species, and an almost pathetic eagerness to please their galactic neighbors. They're harmless, predictable, and utterly dependent on the protection of stronger races. She's about to discover just how catastrophically wrong she is. When a routine diplomatic mission goes horribly wrong and Princess Zarahai finds herself stranded on a death world with only a single human escort, she expects to witness the final, pitiful moments of a doomed species trying desperately to protect someone far beyond his capability to save. What she doesn't expect is to watch every apex predator on the planet, creatures that have terrorized her nightmares since childhood, take one look at her human companion and quietly step aside. Some truths about humanity, she's about to learn, are far too dangerous to be written in any diplomatic file. Princess Zarahai of the Veltar Empire adjusted the ceremonial sash across her azure-scale chest and gazed through the viewport of the diplomatic cruiser at the approaching space station. The massive structure rotated slowly against the backdrop of distant stars, its sleek design unmistakably human in origin. Everything about it seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable compared to the towering spires of Veltar architecture or the crystalline magnificence of Zephyrite constructions. Your Highness, her aide, Commander Velthak, approached with his usual mixture of reverence and barely concealed anxiety. The human delegation has confirmed their readiness to receive us. Ambassador Chen awaits in Docking Bay 7. Zarahai nodded absently, her golden eyes still fixed on the station. Tell me again why my father insists on this particular alliance? The humans control barely 50 systems, and their military capabilities are modest at best. Velthak's scaled brow furrowed. The Emperor believes their diplomatic neutrality could prove valuable in the upcoming hegemon negotiations. They've somehow managed to maintain peaceful relations with 17 different species, including several that consider each other mortal enemies. Through weakness and submission, Zarahai muttered. They agree to everything because they lack the strength to disagree. She turned from the viewport, her flowing robes rustling against the deck plating. Very well. Let's get this over with. How long until we reach the conference site? 6 standard hours, Your Highness. The meeting is taking place on Kepler 442c, a world the humans have designated as neutral territory. Zarahai had read the file on Kepler 442c. It was a garden world, lush and temperate, with gravity slightly lighter than most inhabited planets. The humans had established a small research outpost there but otherwise left it largely untouched. Another example of their peculiar tendency to treat potentially valuable resources with inexplicable reverence. The docking procedure proceeded smoothly, and, within an hour, Zarahai found herself seated across from Ambassador Chen in the station's observation lounge. The human was smaller than she had expected, perhaps coming up to her shoulder if they stood together. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his brown eyes held the kind of tired wisdom that came from years of delicate negotiations. Princess Zarahai, Ambassador Chen said, rising and offering what humans called a bow. It's an honor to meet you. I've heard great things about your work in reforming trade agreements between the Inner Rim species. Ambassador, Zarahai replied with a polite nod. She had to admit the human was more articulate than she'd anticipated. I trust your preparation for the hegemon negotiations is proceeding well? Chen's smile was genuine but guarded. As well as can be expected when trying to convince a dozen species to agree on anything. Your presence will certainly lend weight to the proceedings. They discussed logistics over what humans call tea, though Zarahai found the beverage bland compared to the fermented fruit drinks of her homeworld. Chen was professional, knowledgeable, and appropriately deferential, exactly what she had expected from a human diplomat. He spoke of compromise and mutual benefit, of finding common ground and building bridges. All very noble and very naive. I've arranged for one of our best people to escort you to the surface, Chen said as their meeting drew to a close. Lieutenant Marcus Webb. He has extensive experience with wilderness survival and first contact protocols. Is an escort really necessary? Zarahai asked. My understanding is that Kepler 442c is largely uninhabited. Chen's expression became slightly more serious. The research outpost is small, and the planet does have some challenging wildlife. Lieutenant Webb will ensure you reach the conference site safely and comfortably. Zarahai almost smiled at that. The idea that she, a princess of the Veltar Empire, whose people had conquered 3 star systems before humans had even discovered fire, needed protection from local fauna was almost amusing. But she nodded graciously. Humans seemed to take their protective instincts seriously, even when they were laughably inadequate to the task. Lieutenant Marcus Webb arrived at the transport bay 30 minutes later, and Zarahai's first impression was one of profound disappointment. If this was one of their best people, humanity's reputation for mediocrity was well-founded. The human was tall for his species, perhaps 6.5 feet, with brown hair and unremarkable features. He wore standard expedition gear that looked practical but unimpressive, and his only visible weapon was a simple sidearm that probably wouldn't stop a Veltar hatchling. Your Highness, Webb said, offering the same respectful bow she'd received from Chen. I'm honored to be assigned to your security detail. Lieutenant, she replied, studying him more carefully. There was something in his eyes, a kind of quiet alertness that she hadn't expected. But his overall demeanor was calm to the point of being almost sleepy. I trust the journey to the surface will be uneventful? Yes, ma'am. The shuttle flight takes about 40 minutes, and we'll land directly at the conference facility. The local wildlife tends to avoid the cleared areas around the outpost. They boarded the shuttle along with Zarahai's reduced entourage, Commander Velthak, 2 diplomatic attaches, and a single honor guard named Kestar who had insisted on accompanying them despite her protests. The shuttle itself was another example of human engineering pragmatism over elegance, functional but uninspiring. As they descended through Kepler 442c's atmosphere, Zarahai found herself impressed despite her preconceptions. The planet was genuinely beautiful, with vast green forests stretching to the horizon, broken by silver rivers and distant mountain ranges. The research outpost appeared as they dropped through the cloud layer, a cluster of modest buildings surrounded by carefully maintained clearings. Magnificent world, Velthak observed, leaning toward one of the viewports. The humans were wise to preserve its natural state. Wise or simply lacking the ambition to properly develop it, Zarahai replied, though privately she had to admit there was something appealing about the untouched wilderness. Lieutenant Webb, who had been quiet during most of the flight, turned from his position near the pilot's station. We'll be landing in about 5 minutes, Your Highness. The conference delegates from the other species arrived yesterday and are settling in well. Any problems with the local environment? Commander Velthak asked. Webb's expression remained neutral. Nothing unusual. The facility has standard perimeter defenses, and the wildlife generally keeps its distance. Kepler 442c has a fairly stable ecosystem. As they approached the landing pad, Zarahai noticed movement in the forest beyond the cleared areas. Dark shapes moving between the trees, too distant to identify clearly but large enough to be significant. What sort of wildlife are we talking about, Lieutenant? The usual assortment you'd expect on a world like this, Webb replied calmly. Some large herbivores, a few predator species. The research team has been monitoring them for 3 years without any significant incidents. The shuttle touched down with barely a tremor, another small testament to human engineering competence. As the engines wound down, Webb stood and checked his equipment with methodical thoroughness. Zarahai watched him work, noting the practiced efficiency of his movements. Perhaps he wasn't quite as soft as most humans appeared to be. The facility director will meet us at the shuttle, Webb explained as he activated the exit ramp. Dr. Sarah Kovac. She's been looking forward to hosting the conference. They disembarked into warm, humid air that carried the sense of rich earth and growing things. Zarahai had to admit the planet's atmosphere was pleasant, though she noticed that Lieutenant Webb immediately took a position where he could observe both the shuttle and the surrounding tree line. Professional paranoia or genuine caution? Dr. Kovac proved to be another slight, unremarkable human, though her enthusiasm was unmistakable. She greeted Zarahai with appropriate ceremony and launched into a detailed explanation of the facility's accommodations and schedule. The other delegates had indeed arrived safely, and the first session would begin the following morning. "We've prepared quarters that should meet your cultural requirements," Dr. Kovac explained as they walked toward the main building. "And our kitchen staff has researched Veltar dietary needs extensively." "Thank you, Doctor. I'm sure everything will be satisfactory." As they approached the entrance, Zarahai noticed that Lieutenant Webb had fallen slightly behind, his attention seemingly focused on something in the forest. She followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual, just the natural swaying of leaves and branches in the afternoon breeze. "Is there a problem, Lieutenant?" she asked. Webb turned back to her with that same calm expression. "No problem, Your Highness. Just maintaining situational awareness." They entered the facility, which proved to be more comfortable than its modest exterior had suggested. The humans had done their research, providing accommodations that respected the cultural preferences of all 6 species attending the conference. Zarahai's quarters were spacious and well-appointed, with a communications array that would allow her to stay in contact with her father's court. That evening, she joined the other delegates for what Dr. Kovac called a meet and greet dinner. The hegemon representative, Ambassador Thrix Tal, was a towering insectoid whose species had dominated 3 sectors before joining the galactic community. The Zephyrite delegate, Resonance of Crystal Song, communicated through harmonic frequencies that required a translation device. 2 species she didn't recognize completed the group, along with their various attendants and security personnel. Lieutenant Webb stationed himself near the wall where he could observe the entire room, declining Dr. Kovac's invitation to join the meal. Zarahai found herself watching him occasionally, noting how his eyes constantly swept the room and windows. Either he took his protective duties very seriously, or he knew something about this planet that hadn't been included in the briefings. The dinner conversation was predictably diplomatic, with each delegate carefully probing the other's positions without revealing too much of their own intentions. Zarahai had attended dozens of such gatherings, and the dance of words and implications was as familiar as breathing. What was less familiar was the way Lieutenant Webb occasionally turned his head toward the windows, as if listening for something. "The human approach to security seems quite thorough," Ambassador Thrix Tal observed during a lull in conversation, his translator rendering his clicking speech into standard. "Though I confess I'm curious about the necessity on such a peaceful world." Dr. Kovac smiled diplomatically. "We believe in being prepared for any contingency. Lieutenant Webb has extensive experience with wilderness environments." "How extensive?" the hegemon ambassador pressed, his multifaceted eyes fixing on the human soldier. Webb answered without leaving his position. 12 years of deployment on 17 different worlds, sir. Including several designated as extreme environment. Impressive for such a young species, Thrix Tal mused. Though I wonder what challenges a world like this could pose to someone with such experience. Every environment has its unique characteristics, Webb replied neutrally. Preparation and respect for local conditions are always advisable. Zarahai noticed that he hadn't actually answered the question, deflecting it with generalities. Either he was being modest about his capabilities or deliberately vague about potential threats. Given what she knew about humans, modesty seemed more likely. The evening concluded without incident, and Zarahai retired to her quarters feeling cautiously optimistic about the negotiations ahead. The other delegates seemed reasonable, and even the hegemon representative appeared willing to consider compromise. Perhaps this conference would proceed more smoothly than expected. She was awakened in the early hours of the morning by a sound she couldn't immediately identify. A low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from the forest beyond the facility. She lay still, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. Probably some large herbivore moving through the underbrush, nothing to be concerned about. But, as she drifted back to sleep, she found herself thinking about Lieutenant Webb and the way he'd watched the tree line with such careful attention. Perhaps there was more to this peaceful world than the briefings had indicated. Outside her window, something large moved through the darkness between the trees, its presence marked only by the sudden silence of the night creatures. In the facility's security station, motion sensors registered the movement and automatically filed a report that would be reviewed in the morning. And, throughout the building, the delegates of 6 different species slept peacefully, protected by nothing more than a few humans and their inexplicable confidence in their ability to keep everyone safe. In the forest, ancient predators that had ruled this world for millions of years felt the unfamiliar scent carried on the night wind. They had learned, through generations of evolution, to recognize the signs of danger. And something about that scent made them turn away, seeking easier prey elsewhere in the vast wilderness. Lieutenant Marcus Webb stood at his post, alert and watchful, while the others slept soundly in their beds. He had not slept through the night in 12 years, and he did not intend to start now. Not when there were people depending on him to keep them safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, at least, all was well. The conference began promptly at 900 hours with all delegates assembled in the facility's main meeting room. Zarahai took her position at the hexagonal table, noting how the humans had carefully arranged the seating to ensure no species held a position of obvious dominance over the others. Another example of their obsession with diplomatic equality, though she had to admit it was tactfully done. Ambassador Thrixtal began with the expected formal presentations, outlining the Hegemon Collective's position on trade regulations and territorial boundaries. His species had controlled these negotiations for decades through a combination of economic pressure and barely veiled military threats, but today his approach seemed surprisingly conciliatory. Perhaps the presence of neutral human mediators was already having an effect. Resonance of Crystal Song followed with the Zephyrite perspective, her harmonic communications translated into concepts of crystalline growth patterns and energy flow dynamics that somehow related to resource distribution. Zarahai had learned to appreciate Zephyrite logic over the years, though their tendency to think in geological timeframes could be frustrating during urgent negotiations. Dr. Kovac served as moderator, guiding the discussion with questions that seemed naive on the surface but actually revealed significant insight into the underlying issues. Zarahai found herself grudgingly impressed with the humans' diplomatic skills, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something rehearsed about the entire proceeding. Lieutenant Webb remained at his position near the windows, apparently paying attention to the negotiations while maintaining his watch over the surrounding area. Twice during the morning session, Zarahai noticed him touch the communication device in his ear and speak quietly into his collar mic, too softly for the translation systems to pick up his words. Lieutenant Webb, Ambassador Thrixtal said during a break in the proceedings, "You seem unusually vigilant for such a peaceful setting. Is there something specific you're watching for?" Webb's response was professionally neutral. "Standard security protocols, Ambassador. We want to ensure everyone remains safe and comfortable during the conference." Of course, the Hegemon representative clicked thoughtfully. "Though I must admit, your reputation for hospitality is somewhat at odds with your apparent military preparedness." "Hospitality and security aren't mutually exclusive, sir," Webb replied. "Good hosts protect their guests." Zarahai watched this exchange with growing curiosity. There was definitely something the humans weren't sharing about this planet. The facility's security measures seemed excessive for a simple research outpost, and Webb's behavior suggested he was expecting trouble from a very specific source. The morning session concluded with preliminary agreements on 3 minor trade issues and a schedule for the afternoon's more challenging discussions. As the delegates dispersed for lunch, Zarahai noticed that Webb approached Dr. Kovac for a brief, private conversation. Their voices were too low to overhear, but their body language suggested concern rather than routine coordination. Commander Velthak joined her for the midday meal in the facility's dining area, which had been arranged to accommodate the dietary needs of all 6 species. The view through the large windows showed the cleared area around the buildings and the forest beyond, peaceful and undisturbed in the afternoon sunlight. "The negotiations proceed more smoothly than expected," Velthak observed, sampling what the humans called a salad with obvious appreciation. "Even Ambassador Thrixtal seems willing to consider reasonable compromises." "Perhaps," Zarahai replied, though her attention was drawn to movement at the forest's edge. Something large had emerged from the trees, too distant to see clearly but massive enough to be visible across the clearing. "Commander, do you see that?" Velthak followed her gaze and his scaled features tightened. By the seven suns. That creature is enormous. Dr. Kovac appeared at their table almost immediately, though she seemed more concerned with their reaction than with whatever they were looking at. Is everything all right, Your Highness? That animal, Zarahai pointed toward the forest edge. What species is it? Dr. Kovac glanced through the window with what seemed like practiced indifference. Oh, that's just one of the local herbivores. Probably a titanosaur derivative. They're quite harmless, actually, just very large. Harmless? Velthak's voice carried obvious skepticism. That creature must be 30 meters long. Size doesn't always correlate with aggression, Dr. Kovac replied cheerfully. The titanosaurs are plant eaters. They generally ignore anything smaller than themselves, which includes pretty much everything else on the planet. As they watched, the enormous creature lowered its long neck to graze on the vegetation near the tree line. Its movements were indeed peaceful, but Zarahai couldn't shake the impression that something about the scene was wrong. The animal seemed nervous, constantly raising its head to scan the forest as if watching for predators. What hunts something that size? She asked. Dr. Kovac's smile became slightly strained. Well, there are a few large predators, but they generally avoid the area around the facility. Our presence tends to discourage them from coming too close. Your presence? Commander Velthak sounded intrigued. Forgive me, Doctor, but humans are not typically considered intimidating by large predators. We have various deterrent systems, Dr. Kovac replied vaguely. Motion sensors, sonic barriers, that sort of thing. Very effective at keeping the dangerous wildlife at a safe distance. Lieutenant Webb chose that moment to approach their table, his expression professionally neutral but his timing suspiciously convenient. Dr. Kovac, you're needed in the communications center. Priority message from the orbital station. Of course. Dr. Kovac excused herself quickly, leaving Zarahai with the distinct impression that the conversation had been deliberately terminated. Interesting, Velthak murmured as they watched the doctor hurry away. Either they're hiding something about this planet's ecosystem, or they're remarkably paranoid about routine wildlife. Both, I suspect, Zarahai replied. She studied Lieutenant Webb, who remained near their table with the obvious intention of preventing further questions about local predators. Tell me, Lieutenant, what exactly are these deterrent systems Dr. Kovac mentioned? Standard perimeter security, Your Highness. Nothing particularly sophisticated. But, effective against creatures that could threaten a titanosaur? Webb's pause was barely perceptible. The local ecosystem is more complex than it might appear. We've found that prevention is preferable to confrontation. Before Zarahai could press further, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Not the harsh klaxons of an emergency, but a steady, rhythmic tone that suggested a predetermined signal rather than an immediate crisis. What does that mean? She asked, rising from her chair. Perimeter alert, Webb replied, his relaxed demeanor instantly shifting to full alertness. All delegates need to move to the secure areas immediately. Secure areas? Velthak stood as well, his hand moving instinctively to his ceremonial weapon. From what threat? Standard protocol, Commander. Please follow me. Webb led them through the facility with quick, efficient movements that spoke of extensive practice. Other delegates were being similarly escorted by their human hosts, all moving toward the central section of the building. Zarahai noticed that the humans seemed more concerned with speed than with explanation, herding their guests with polite but firm urgency. They reached what appeared to be a reinforced section of the building, with walls noticeably thicker than the rest of the facility and windows that looked like they were designed to withstand significant impact. Dr. Kovac was already there, monitoring multiple display screens that showed various views of the surrounding area. How long do these alerts typically last? Ambassador Thrixtal asked, his translator rendering his obvious agitation into formal diplomatic language. That depends, Dr. Kovac replied absently, her attention focused on the screens. Usually not long, but we prefer to wait until we're certain the area is clear. Clear of what? Zarahai demanded. Dr. Kovac, I think we deserve an honest explanation of what's happening. The human researcher looked up from her screens with obvious reluctance. The planet's ecosystem includes some very large predators. Occasionally they venture closer to the facility than we'd prefer. When that happens, we implement security protocols until they move on. Show us, resonance of crystal song harmonized through her translator. Our crystalline nature requires visual confirmation of threat parameters. Dr. Kovac hesitated, glancing at Lieutenant Webb, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. She touched one of the screens, switching the view to a camera positioned at the forest edge near where they had seen the titanosaur. The enormous herbivore was still there, but its behavior had changed dramatically. Instead of peacefully grazing, it was backing away from the forest with obvious terror, its massive head swiveling frantically as it searched for escape routes. Its distress calls echoed through the facility's audio pickups, deep, rumbling vocalizations that spoke of primal fear. "What is it afraid of?" Velthak whispered. The answer emerged from the forest like a nightmare-given form. The creature that stepped into view was clearly built for killing, standing nearly 15 meters tall on powerful legs that ended in claws the size of sword blades. Its elongated skull held jaws that could easily crush the titanosaur's neck in a single bite, and its hide was scarred with the marks of countless battles. Every line of its body spoke of perfect evolutionary adaptation to the role of apex predator. "Sweet mother of stars," one of the unidentified delegates breathed in his own language. The predator moved with fluid grace despite its size, stalking the terrified herbivore with obvious confidence. But what captured Zarahai's attention was not the hunt itself, but the predator's behavior. Instead of attacking immediately, it seemed to be listening. Its massive head turned toward the facility, and, for a moment that stretched like an eternity, it appeared to be studying the building with intelligent consideration. "It knows we're here," she said quietly. "Yes," Lieutenant Webb replied, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the secure area. "They're very intelligent. Much more so than most species realize." "They?" Ambassador Thrickstal's compound eyes fixed on the human soldier. "There are more of these creatures?" "This is their territory," Webb explained calmly. "The facility was built here because it represents neutral ground. The different predator species have arrangements with each other regarding hunting grounds and boundaries." On the screen, the massive predator took another step toward the facility, and Zarahai felt her scales ripple with instinctive fear. The creature was close enough now that she could see the intelligence in its eyes, an alien consciousness that seemed to be evaluating the situation with careful consideration. Then, without warning, it stopped. For several long moments, the predator remained motionless, its attention apparently focused on something they couldn't see. Finally, with movements that seemed almost deliberate, it turned away from both the facility and the titanosaur and disappeared back into the forest. The screen showed the herbivore waiting several more minutes before cautiously resuming its grazing, though it remained obviously nervous. "That's it?" Zarahai asked. "It just left?" "They usually do," Dr. Kovac replied, though her relief was obvious. "As I said, they tend to avoid the area around the facility." "But why?" Velthak pressed. "That creature could have easily breached these walls if it chose to. What makes it decide to leave?" Dr. Kovac and Lieutenant Webb exchanged another look, and Zarahai had the distinct impression that they were communicating something the translation software couldn't interpret. "The deterrent systems are quite effective," Dr. Kovac said finally. "We've never had a serious incident with the local predators. What kind of deterrent could possibly discourage a creature like that?" Ambassador Thrickstal demanded. "Sonic barriers? Chemical repellents? Some form of energy field?" "Something like that," Webb replied vaguely. The alarm ceased, replaced by an all-clear signal, and Dr. Kovac announced that they could return to the main areas of the facility. As they filed out of the secure section, Zarahai lingered near Lieutenant Webb. "You're not telling us everything, are you?" she said quietly. Webb met her gaze directly, and, for the first time she saw something in his eyes that wasn't entirely human. Not alien, exactly, but something that suggested depths she hadn't suspected. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "there are aspects of human-wildlife relations that don't translate well into diplomatic summaries. We've learned to coexist with the local ecosystem through methods that work better than they sound in official reports." "What methods?" "Mutual respect, mostly. We stay out of their territory, and they stay out of ours. That creature could have easily killed us all. Why would it respect human territory? Webb was quiet for a long moment, and, when he spoke, his voice carried an undertone she couldn't identify. Because some things are more dangerous than they appear, and intelligence often recognizes intelligence. Before Zarahai could ask what he meant, Commander Velthak called for her attention from across the room. The afternoon session was scheduled to begin, and the other delegates were already taking their positions. She followed reluctantly, but her mind remained focused on the image of that massive predator and the way it had simply chosen to leave. As the negotiations resumed, she found herself watching Lieutenant Webb more carefully. His behavior hadn't changed, but her perception of it had. The way he positioned himself, the constant awareness of his surroundings, the quiet confidence in his ability to protect them all from creatures that could tear through the facility's walls like paper. What did he know that she didn't? And why did she have the growing suspicion that humanity's reputation for weakness might be the greatest diplomatic deception in galactic history? The afternoon negotiations proceeded with deceptive normalcy, but Zarahai found her attention constantly divided between the diplomatic discussions and the mystery of their human hosts. Every few minutes, her gaze drifted to Lieutenant Webb, who maintained his vigilant position despite the apparent return to routine. Something about his posture suggested he was still listening for threats that the others couldn't perceive. Ambassador Thrixtal was pressing for expanded hegemon trade privileges when the second alert came. This time, the alarms were different, sharper, more urgent, with an underlying rhythm that spoke of immediate danger rather than precautionary measures. All delegates to secure positions immediately, Dr. Kovac announced, her previous diplomatic composure replaced by crisp military efficiency. This is not a drill. Lieutenant Webb moved with fluid precision, directing the group toward the reinforced section of the facility while speaking rapidly into his comm unit in terms that were too technical for the translators to process effectively. Zarahai caught fragments, multiple contacts, northern perimeter, pack formation. They reached the secure area to find the monitoring screens already active, displaying feeds from cameras positioned throughout the facility's perimeter. What Zarahai saw made her breath catch in her throat. The forest around the facility was alive with movement. Shapes flowed between the trees, not the lumbering progress of the massive predator they had seen earlier, but the coordinated movements of something far more dangerous. Pack hunters. How many? Webb asked Dr. Kovac, his voice carrying an authority that seemed at odds with his apparent subordinate position. 17 confirmed, probably more, she replied, manipulating the camera controls to track the moving figures. The main pack is approaching from the north, but we've got scouts circling around to the east and west. Scouts? Velthak's voice was tight with concern. These creatures coordinate their attacks? Shadow wolves, Dr. Kovac explained reluctantly. They're the apex pack hunters on Kepler 442c. Highly intelligent, extremely adaptable, and absolutely ruthless when they decide to hunt. On the screens, the creatures became more visible as they reached the cleared areas around the facility. They were roughly the size of a Veltar warrior, but built with the lean efficiency of pure predators. Their dark fur seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their movements held the liquid grace of something that had never known fear. Their beautiful resonance of crystal song harmonized, her translated words carrying undertones of aesthetic appreciation mixed with terror. They're death incarnate, Webb corrected quietly. Shadow wolves have never been successfully domesticated, contained, or deterred by any species we've encountered. They hunt what they choose to hunt, when they choose to hunt it. Then, why build a facility in their territory? Ambassador Thrixtal demanded. Webb and Dr. Kovac exchanged another of their meaningful looks, and Zarahai decided she had heard enough evasions. Stop, she said, her voice carrying the authority of royal command. Both of you. No more diplomatic half-truths or convenient omissions. These creatures are obviously a known threat, yet you established a research facility in the middle of their hunting grounds. You've hosted diplomatic conferences here before, which means you have some way of managing the danger. I want to know exactly how you keep us safe from predators that you've just admitted can't be deterred by normal means. Dr. Kovac looked to Lieutenant Webb, who studied the assembled delegates for a long moment before speaking. The shadow wolves aren't hunting us, he said finally.
They're investigating us. Investigating?
Velfax's translator struggled with the concept.
For what purpose? To determine whether we represent a threat to their territory, Webb explained.
They're incredibly intelligent, as I mentioned. They evaluate potential dangers before deciding how to respond. On the screens, the pack had emerged fully from the forest and was moving in a complex pattern around the facility.
Their formation was clearly tactical, designed to encircle and evaluate rather than immediately attack.
Several of the larger individuals had taken positions where they could observe the building directly, their attention focused with unmistakable intelligence.
What determines their decision? Zarahai asked. Webb was quiet for several heartbeats before answering. Scent, mostly.
They can identify species, emotional states, even recent activities through chemical analysis. They're looking for specific markers that indicate whether we're predators or prey.
And humans register as.
That's complicated. The largest of the shadow wolves approached the main entrance to the facility, moving with the careful deliberation of something conducting a thorough inspection. It stopped just outside the door and raised its head, clearly scenting the air currents that carried information about the building's occupants.
Zarahai watched in fascination as the creature's behavior shifted. Its body language changed from hunting alertness to something that looked almost like recognition.
The wolf's ears moved forward, and it tilted its head in a gesture that seemed oddly familiar.
It knows something, she said aloud. They know humans, Webb admitted.
We've been studying this world for 3 years. The various predator species have learned to identify our presence.
And they don't consider you a threat? Ambassador Thrickstal's compound eyes reflected the screen images with kaleidoscopic intensity. They consider us something else entirely.
Before anyone could ask for clarification, the shadow wolf at the entrance moved to the door itself and scratched. Not the violent assault they had all been expecting, but a deliberate, rhythmic scratching that sounded almost like a code. Dr. Kovac moved to a control panel and activated an intercom system.
"Hello, Shadowfawn," she said conversationally. "How's the territory today?"
The wolf's response was a complex vocalization, not quite a howl, not quite a bark, but something that carried clear communicative intent. "She says the northern hunting grounds are productive, but there's been some territorial dispute with the canyon drakes," Dr. Kovac translated, apparently without the aid of any mechanical device.
"You can understand them?"
Resonance of Crystal Song's harmonic frequencies rose to what her species considered a note of pure amazement.
"Basic communication, yes.
We've been working on interspecies protocols since the facility was established." Zarahai stared at the screen, where the massive predator was now sitting calmly outside the door like some enormous domestic pet waiting for its owner to return. The other pack members had visibly relaxed, settling into resting positions that maintained their perimeter but no longer suggested imminent attack.
"This is impossible," she said flatly. "You're telling us that you've domesticated apex predators that have never been successfully contained by any other species?" "Not domesticated," Webb corrected carefully. "We've established diplomatic relations." "With wolves?" "With intelligent apex predators who happen to resemble wolves." The distinction seemed important to him, though Zarahai couldn't understand why.
On the screens, Shadowfang rose and moved to the side of the building, where another camera tracked her progress to a section of wall that looked no different from any other. The wolf placed one paw against a specific panel, which immediately lit up with a soft blue glow. "Biometric scanner," Dr. Kovac explained. "Shadowfang is registered in our security system."
"The predators have security clearance?"
Velfax's voice had risen to nearly a squeak.
"The term predator is relative," Webb said. "From their perspective, we might be the dangerous ones."
The panel that Shadowfang had touched opened to reveal a small compartment containing what appeared to be several large pieces of synthesized meat. The wolf retrieved them with careful precision and immediately began distributing them to other pack members, who accepted the gifts with obvious gratitude. "You're feeding them," Ambassador Thrickstal observed.
"We're maintaining positive diplomatic relations," Dr. Kovac corrected.
The synthesized protein provides nutritional supplements that help the pack maintain their health during seasonal food shortages.
"In exchange for what?"
"Protection," Lieutenant Webb said simply.
Shadowfang's pack controls this territory. By maintaining good relations with them, we ensure that other predator species know this area is under their protection.
Zarahai felt a chill that had nothing to do with the facility's climate controls.
You're using them as guards?
We're allied with them, Webb replied.
There's a difference. Allied.
With wolves. With intelligent beings who happen to have evolved into forms that resemble wolves. Again, the distinction seemed crucial to him. Zarahai studied the screens, where the shadow wolves were completing their patrol and preparing to return to the forest. Their movements were coordinated and purposeful, showing clear evidence of sophisticated tactical thinking.
How intelligent? She asked quietly.
Intelligent enough to recognize that cooperation is more beneficial than conflict, Dr. Kovac replied. Intelligent enough to understand the concept of mutual defense agreements. Intelligent enough to distinguish between species that pose a threat to their territory and species that might prove useful as allies.
And they consider humans useful? Webb's smile was the first genuinely amused expression she had seen from him. They consider humans interesting. We're apparently the first species they've encountered that doesn't automatically assume aggression is the appropriate response to meeting apex predators.
Because you're too weak to fight them?
Because we're smart enough not to. The implications hit Zarahai like a physical blow.
Humans hadn't survived on this world despite being weak, they had survived by being intelligent enough to form alliances with creatures that could effortlessly destroy any military force most species could deploy. The territorial dispute Dr. Kovac mentioned, she said slowly.
What are canyon drakes?
Flying predators, Webb replied. About the size of a small shuttle, with intelligence comparable to the shadow wolves.
They've been expanding their territory eastward, which brings them into conflict with Shadowfang's pack.
And you're supporting the wolves in this conflict?
We're providing intelligence and tactical advice, Dr. Kovac admitted.
Nothing direct, but we've helped them understand Drake behavioral patterns and suggested defensive strategies. You're conducting military operations with alien wolves against alien dragons, Velthak said faintly.
We're honoring our alliance obligations, Webb corrected.
Shadowfang's pack has been protecting this facility for 3 years.
We owe them support when their territory is threatened.
On the screens, the last of the shadow wolves disappeared into the forest, leaving the cleared area around the facility peaceful once again. But Zarahai's perception of that peace had changed fundamentally. This wasn't the safety of isolation or technological superiority, this was the protection offered by creatures that could destroy the facility and everyone in it without significant effort, but chose not to because they had found humans worth preserving. How many species have you formed these alliances with? She asked.
Webb and Dr. Kovac exchanged yet another meaningful look. On Kepler 442c? 7 confirmed, 3 more in preliminary negotiations, Dr. Kovac replied.
Each relationship is unique, based on the specific characteristics and needs of the species involved.
7 apex predator species consider humans valuable enough to protect?
7 apex predator species consider humans interesting enough to avoid eating, Webb corrected with dry humor.
The protection is a secondary benefit.
But it's real protection?
The most effective protection possible, Dr. Kovac confirmed. No other species in the galaxy commands the respect of this planet's ecosystem the way humans do.
Zarahai sank back in her chair, her mind reeling from the implications.
Humans weren't weak prey species that had somehow stumbled onto diplomatic success, they were apex social predators who had evolved the ability to form symbiotic relationships with other apex predators. The most dangerous creatures on one of the galaxy's most dangerous worlds considered them worthy allies. And if that was true here, what other assumptions about human capabilities might be completely wrong?
The negotiations, she said suddenly.
This entire conference. You didn't choose this location for its neutrality, did you? Webb's smile was answer enough. You chose it to demonstrate that humans can survive in environments where the rest of us require extensive protection. To show that our assumptions about your species' limitations might be fundamentally flawed. We chose it because it's genuinely neutral territory, Dr. Kovac replied diplomatically.
The fact that it also provides certain strategic demonstrations was a consideration. Outside, something howled in the distance, not the shadow wolves, but something else entirely. Something larger and more dangerous than anything Zarahai had imagined. And, somewhere in the facility, Lieutenant Marcus Webb smiled to himself and continued his watch, confident in the knowledge that whatever was out there had already learned to give humans the respect they deserved. The princess of the Veltar Empire sat in her chair and wondered what else about humanity she had completely misunderstood. The evening session of negotiations proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with trade agreements or territorial boundaries. Every delegate had been affected by the afternoon's revelations, though each processed the information differently. Ambassador Thrixtal had become noticeably more respectful in his interactions with the human staff, while residents of Crystalsong seemed genuinely fascinated by the concept of interspecies alliance building. Zarahai found herself studying every human gesture and expression, looking for clues about what other assumptions she might need to reconsider. Dr. Kovac had returned to her role as diplomatic facilitator, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, less deferent, more confident. As if the revelation about humanity's true capabilities had allowed her to drop a carefully maintained mask. Lieutenant Webb continued his vigilant watch, though Zarahai now understood that his alertness served multiple purposes. He wasn't just protecting them from potential threats, he was monitoring the complex network of alliances that kept the facility safe. Every few minutes, he would touch his comm unit and listen to brief reports that were undoubtedly updates from his non-human allies. Princess Zarahai, Ambassador Thrixtal said during a break in the formal discussions, I find myself reconsidering many assumptions about human diplomatic capabilities. As am I, she replied carefully. It seems we may have underestimated their strategic thinking. Strategic thinking? The hegemon representative's compound eyes glittered with what might have been amusement. They've established military alliances with apex predators on a death world. I would call that strategic brilliance. Or desperation, Commander Velthak interjected, though his tone suggested he no longer believed his own words. Perhaps they had no choice but to negotiate with the local wildlife. Did they not? Thrixtal mused. Dr. Kovac mentioned that they've hosted diplomatic conferences here before. No species establishes permanent facilities in hostile territory without a compelling reason. Zarahai had been thinking the same thing. The more she considered the situation, the more impressed she became with the subtle demonstration of power. Any species could build fortifications and deploy military forces to protect a diplomatic site. Only humans had apparently thought to recruit the planet's own apex predators as security. The question, she said quietly, is what other capabilities they've chosen not to mention in their diplomatic profiles. As if summoned by her words, Lieutenant Webb approached their group with his characteristic calm professionalism. Your Highness, Ambassador Thrixtal, I wanted to inform you that we'll be implementing enhanced security protocols tonight. The local ecosystem tends to be more active after dark, and we prefer to maintain additional precautions during overnight hours. Enhanced protocols? Thrixtal's translator rendered his clicking speech with obvious interest. Beyond the alliances you've already demonstrated? Different protocols for different circumstances, Webb replied diplomatically. Nighttime brings different challenges. Such as? Webb paused, and Zarahai could see him considering how much to reveal. The apex, he said finally. It hunts at night, and it doesn't recognize territorial boundaries the way the other predator species do. The apex? The dominant predator on Kepler 442c. We've never successfully established communication with it, and our allies prefer to avoid direct confrontation when possible. Dr. Kovac had joined them in time to hear the last exchange. The apex is unique, she added. It's significantly larger than anything else on the planet, and apparently evolved to hunt other apex predators. Even the shadow wolves and canyon drakes give it a wide berth. How large? Velthak asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Best estimates put it at about 40 meters long, Webb replied. Though we've never had an opportunity for direct measurement. 40 meters. Zarahai felt her scales ripple at the thought. The creature they had seen earlier had been intimidating at 15 meters. Something nearly 3 times that size would be beyond most species' ability to comprehend, let alone survive an encounter with.
And your enhanced protocols for dealing with this creature? Thrixtal pressed.
We try very hard not to attract its attention, Dr. Kovac said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes.
So far, that approach has proven effective. How effective?
We've been here 3 years without a direct encounter, Webb replied. Though there have been indicators that it's aware of our presence. As if the universe had been listening to their conversation and decided to provide a demonstration, a sound echoed across the clearing that made every delegate freeze in place. It was low, resonant, and carried undertones of power that spoke to something primal in their evolutionary memory. Not a roar, not a howl, but something deeper and more disturbing, a sound that suggested intelligence behind the raw physical dominance.
That would be one of the indicators, Dr. Kovac said calmly, though Zarahai noticed her hands were trembling slightly.
The sound came again, closer this time, and was answered by a chorus of vocalizations from the forest, the shadow wolves, the distant calls of what might have been canyon drakes, and several other species they hadn't yet identified. But these weren't hunting calls or territorial challenges.
They sounded more like warnings? The local predators are announcing their positions, Webb explained, apparently reading their confusion. Standard protocol when the apex is active. Everyone identifies their location to avoid accidental confrontation.
Everyone except humans, Zarahai observed.
Webb's smile was grim.
We use different methods.
What methods?
Before he could answer, another alarm sounded through the facility, not the sharp warnings they had heard earlier, but a deep, pulsing tone that seemed designed to travel through bone and tissue rather than just air.
All delegates to secure positions, Dr. Kovac announced, though this time her voice carried none of the crisp efficiency they had heard before. Instead, she sounded tired, like someone preparing for a very long night.
They moved to the reinforced section of the facility again, but the atmosphere was completely different from their previous visits. The humans were no longer calm and professional, they moved with the focused urgency of people preparing for a genuine threat. Lieutenant Webb had activated additional monitoring stations, and Dr. Kovac was coordinating with multiple teams through her comm system.
How often does this happen?
Resonance of crystal song harmonized, her translated words carrying overtones of crystalline stress patterns. Monthly, sometimes less, Dr. Kovac replied absently, most of her attention focused on the monitoring screens.
The apex seems to patrol its territory on an irregular schedule. We've never been able to establish a reliable pattern.
The screen showed the area around the facility in enhanced night vision, revealing details that would have been invisible in normal light. The forest was alive with movement as various predator species positioned themselves according to whatever protocol governed their interactions with the apex.
Even the massive titanosaur herbivores had retreated deeper into the woods.
There, Webb said quietly, pointing to one of the screens. At first, Zarahai saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, movement caught her eye, something enormous flowing between the trunks with impossible grace. The camera tracking system tried to follow it, but the creature moved faster than the mechanical systems could compensate for, appearing as brief glimpses of impossible size and alien intelligence.
By the seven suns, Velthak breathed. How do you maintain security against something like that?
Very carefully, Webb replied. The apex emerged into a clearing about a kilometer from the facility, and, for the first time they could see it clearly.
Zarahai's mind struggled to process what she was looking at.
The creature was indeed massive, but its proportions were all wrong for anything that should be able to move with the speed they had just witnessed. It combined the bulk of the largest spacefaring vessels with the fluid grace of a natural predator, as if evolution had decided to ignore the normal constraints of physics and biology.
What does it eat? Ambassador Thrixtal asked faintly. Other apex predators, mostly, Dr. Kovac replied. Sometimes titanosaurs if it can catch them. Occasionally it seems to hunt for sport rather than food.
Sport hunting by a 40-meter predator, Thrixtal's translator struggled with the concept.
How has any other species on this planet survived?
Careful territorial management and extremely effective communication protocols, Webb explained. The ecosystem here has evolved remarkable cooperative behaviors. On the screen, the apex raised its massive head and oriented directly toward the facility.
Even through the electronic interface, Zarahai could feel the weight of its attention like a physical pressure.
It knows we're here, she said.
It's known we're here since the first day we arrived, Dr. Kovac replied. The question is what it intends to do about it.
The creature began moving toward them with deliberate purpose, its stride eating up distance at an alarming rate. At its current pace, it would reach the facility perimeter in less than 10 minutes.
Enhanced protocols? Velfak asked tightly. Now would be good, Webb confirmed, activating a control panel that Zarahai hadn't seen him use before.
The screens immediately showed new activity as hidden systems around the facility came online. What had appeared to be simple landscape lighting revealed itself as a complex array of sensors and projectors, creating patterns of light and sound that meant nothing to the delegates but apparently carried significance for the approaching predator.
Communication attempt? Dr. Kovac asked. Standard friendship protocols, Webb confirmed. Let's see if it's in a diplomatic mood tonight.
The apex paused in its approach, its massive head tilting as it evaluated the signals being transmitted. For several long minutes, it remained motionless, apparently considering its options. Then, with movements that seemed almost thoughtful, it settled into a resting position just outside the perimeter of the facility's enhanced sensor array. It's waiting, Zarahai observed.
It's thinking, Webb corrected. The apex is extraordinarily intelligent.
It just processes information differently than most species we're familiar with.
What's it thinking about?
Whether we're worth the effort of a closer inspection. They watched in tense silence as the massive predator remained in its position, occasionally turning its attention to different sections of the facility as if conducting a thorough evaluation. At one point, it emitted a complex vocalization that was answered by calls from the shadow wolves in the distance.
What was that? Thrixtal asked.
Information exchange, Dr. Kovac replied.
Shadowfang's pack just vouched for us. Vouched for you? Confirmed that we're allies rather than threats or prey.
The local predator species maintain extensive communication networks for exactly this purpose.
And, the apex will accept their recommendation?
Usually, Webb said. Though it prefers to make its own evaluations. As if hearing his words, the creature rose to its feet and began a slow circuit of the facility perimeter. Its movements were methodical, almost ritualistic, as it investigated various sections of the building and the surrounding area. At several points, it paused to examine specific locations more carefully: the landing pad where their shuttle remained, the main entrance, the sections where different air filtration systems vented the interior atmosphere.
It's analyzing our scent profiles, Webb explained. Learning to identify each species present in the facility. For what purpose? Future reference.
If any of us encounter the apex again, it will remember whether we were associated with this peaceful contact. The implication sent a chill through Zarahai's scales. The creature wasn't just investigating their immediate threat potential, it was building a database of information that would influence how it responded to their entire species in any future encounters.
How often do off-world visitors encounter the apex? She asked carefully.
This is only the third time since we've been monitoring its behavior, Dr.
Kovac replied. Previous encounters were with research teams that didn't have the benefit of local alliance networks. What happened to them? Webb's expression was answer enough.
The apex completed its circuit and returned to its original position, where it settled once again into what appeared to be a comfortable resting pose. But, this time, its attention remained focused on the facility with unmistakable intelligence.
How long does it usually stay? Velfak asked nervously.
That depends, Webb replied. Sometimes it loses interest and leaves within an hour. Sometimes it decides to investigate more thoroughly.
And, when it investigates thoroughly, we implement our final security protocol.
Which is?
Webb's smile was completely humorless. We ask it very politely to go away. And, if it doesn't?
Then, we discover whether 3 years of careful diplomacy have been enough to establish genuine mutual respect. Outside, the apex settled more comfortably into its position and showed every indication of remaining there for the foreseeable future. In the facility's secure area, representatives of 6 galactic civilizations sat in silence and contemplated the reality that their safety depended entirely on the diplomatic skills of a species they had always considered harmlessly naive. Zarahai stared at the screen and wondered how many other fundamental assumptions about humanity she was going to have to abandon before this night was over.
The apex remained in position for 6 hours.
During that time, Zarahai watched Lieutenant Webb transform from a mild-mannered security escort into something she was beginning to recognize as far more dangerous than any predator on Kepler 442c.
He didn't become aggressive or threatening, quite the opposite. He became perfectly, absolutely calm. Every movement was economical and precise.
Every word was carefully chosen and delivered with quiet authority. Every decision was made with the kind of instant calculation that spoke of extensive training in crisis management. The change was so subtle that Zarahai might have missed it entirely if she hadn't been watching specifically for signs of human deception.
Dr. Kovac, Webb said at approximately hour 3, "What's our status on the perimeter sensors?" "All systems nominal. The apex hasn't moved closer than 50 meters to any section of the building." "Local wildlife?" "Shadowfang's pack has established a loose perimeter about 2 kilometers out.
The canyon drakes have withdrawn to their normal roosting areas.
Everything else has cleared the immediate area." "Communication attempts?"
"Standard friendship protocols every 30 minutes. We're getting acknowledgement responses, but no indication of intent." Webb nodded as if this were exactly what he had expected.
"And our guests?"
Dr. Kovac glanced at the assembled delegates, who had been listening to this exchange with growing fascination. Remarkably calm, considering. They're learning, Webb observed with what might have been approval.
"How much have you told them about the advanced protocols?" "Nothing specific.
I thought you might prefer to handle that conversation personally." Zarahai decided she had heard enough careful non-communication. "Lieutenant Webb," she said formally, "I believe it's time for complete honesty about our situation." Webb studied her for a long moment, apparently evaluating something she couldn't identify.
"Complete honesty, Your Highness?"
"Complete honesty. The apex is waiting for me to come outside and introduce myself properly." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Zarahai felt her scales ripple with a mixture of disbelief and growing understanding. "Introduce yourself," she repeated carefully.
"Face to face. Alone."
"It's the standard protocol for first contact with a new group containing unfamiliar species."
"And you intend to do this?"
"I intend to honor the diplomatic obligations that keep this facility safe."
Ambassador Thrixtal leaned forward, his compound eyes fixed on the human soldier. "You're telling us that your security protocols require you to have a personal conversation with a 40-meter apex predator?"
"I'm telling you that the only reason we're all still alive is because the predator species on this planet have learned to trust human judgment about potential threats and allies."
"Trust based on what?"
Webb was quiet for several heartbeats before answering. "Based on 3 years of never lying to them, never breaking our agreements, and never failing to meet our obligations."
"And your obligation in this situation is to risk your life for our safety?" "My obligation is to maintain the diplomatic relationships that protect everyone who visits this planet."
Zarahai stared at him, pieces of a larger puzzle finally beginning to fall into place.
"You've done this before. 17 times. And survived 17 personal meetings with apex predators? 18, if you count tonight."
The casual way he said it was somehow more disturbing than if he had boasted about his accomplishments.
Lieutenant Webb spoke of facing down creatures that could effortlessly destroy entire military units the way other people discussed routine paperwork.
"How?"
Velthak asked faintly.
Very carefully, Webb replied, then seemed to reconsider.
"Actually, that's not entirely accurate.
Careful implies caution and fear.
This requires something else."
"Which is?"
"Respect. Genuine, mutual respect between intelligent apex predators." "You consider yourself an apex predator?"
Resonance of Crystal Song's harmonic frequencies carried undertones of crystalline confusion. "I consider myself a human being," Webb replied simply. "Which amounts to the same thing from the perspective of the local wildlife." Dr. Kovac had been monitoring the external sensors during this conversation, and she looked up with obvious concern. "Marcus, the apex is showing signs of impatience."
"Posture changes, increased vocalizations." I think it's ready for you to make an appearance. Webb checked his equipment with the same methodical precision Zarahai had observed earlier.
Sidearm, communit, emergency medical kit, and, something she hadn't noticed before, a small device that might have been a translation matrix or possibly just a recording system.
Standard friendship protocols while I'm outside, he instructed Dr. Kovac.
If something goes wrong, implement lockdown procedures and contact the orbital station for emergency evacuation. Marcus, Dr. Kovac's voice carried a note of personal concern that hadn't been present in her previous professional communications.
Are you sure about this? The group dynamics are different tonight. Multiple unknown species, higher stress levels. The Apex might interpret the situation differently than usual.
Which is exactly why I need to provide proper introductions, Webb replied calmly. The longer we wait, the more likely it becomes that misunderstanding will lead to unfortunate decisions. He turned to address the assembled delegates directly. Your Highnesses, ambassadors, I want to be absolutely clear about something.
What you're about to witness is not a demonstration of human courage or military capability. It's a diplomatic meeting between representatives of two intelligent species who have learned to coexist through mutual understanding. I ask that you observe quietly and avoid any actions that might be interpreted as threatening or aggressive. What actions would be considered threatening? Thrixtal asked.
Rapid movement, loud vocalizations, or any attempt to activate weapons or defensive systems. The Apex is extremely sensitive to threat indicators, and it will respond to perceived aggression with overwhelming force.
And if something goes wrong? Webb's smile was completely relaxed.
Then, you'll get a very educational lesson in why humans have survived on every death world we've ever encountered.
He walked to the facility's main exit with steady, unhurried steps.
Dr. Kovac activated external monitors so they could watch the encounter, and Zarahai found herself holding her breath as the door cycled open.
Lieutenant Marcus Webb stepped out into the night and walked directly toward the Apex.
The massive creature rose to its feet as he approached, its attention focused with laser intensity on the small figure moving across the cleared ground. Even through the monitoring system, Zarahai could sense the Predator's evaluation process, analyzing movement patterns, sense signatures, and behavioral indicators to determine the appropriate response. Webb stopped at what appeared to be precisely the right distance, close enough to demonstrate respect and courage, far enough to avoid triggering defensive reflexes.
He stood completely still for several long moments, apparently waiting for the Apex to complete its initial assessment.
Then, he began to speak. His words were too quiet for the monitoring system to pick up clearly, but his tone was conversational, almost casual. He gestured occasionally, slow, deliberate movements that somehow conveyed meaning despite the obvious differences in anatomy between human and apex predator.
The Apex listened. It was the most surreal sight Zarahai had ever witnessed.
A creature that could have swallowed a shuttle was sitting attentively while a human being conducted what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary diplomatic conversation. Occasionally, the predator would emit complex vocalizations that Webb seemed to understand, responding with appropriate changes in his own communication patterns.
He's actually talking to it, Velthak whispered. He's conducting formal diplomatic introductions, Dr. Kovac corrected.
Explaining who each delegate represents, what species they belong to, and what our intentions are regarding the local territory.
And it understands? Well enough. The Apex has encountered representatives of several galactic species over the years.
It maintains detailed records of which species have proven trustworthy and which have required correction.
Correction? Ambassador Thrixtal's translator struggled with the euphemism.
Species that have tried to establish military installations in apex predator territory without proper diplomatic protocols have generally found the experience educational, Dr. Kovac replied diplomatically.
On the screen, Webb appeared to be concluding his presentation.
The Apex tilted its massive head in what looked like consideration, then emitted a series of vocalizations that carried obvious communicative intent.
Webb nodded and responded with what sounded like agreement.
Then, incredibly, the human soldier stepped closer to the creature and extended his hand.
What is he doing?
Resonance of crystal song harmonized in what her species considered frequencies of pure terror.
Confirming the diplomatic agreement, Dr. Kovac replied, though her own voice was tight with tension.
The apex lowered its enormous head until its snout was level with Webb's extended hand. For a moment that lasted an eternity, predator and human remained motionless. Then, with movements that seemed almost gentle, the creature brushed against Webb's palm with what might have been the equivalent of a handshake.
The agreement concluded, Webb stepped back and offered what was unmistakably a formal bow.
The apex responded with a complex vocalization that sounded like acknowledgement, then turned and walked back toward the forest with the same deliberate grace it had demonstrated throughout the encounter.
"It's over?" Zarahai asked. "It's over," Dr. Kovac confirmed.
The apex has accepted our explanation and confirmed that all delegates are under the protection of established diplomatic protocols. Webb returned to the facility a few minutes later, appearing completely calm and unruffled by his encounter with a creature that could have killed him with a casual swipe of one claw.
"How do you feel?" Dr. Kovac asked as he entered the secure area.
"Relieved," Webb replied honestly.
The apex was quite reasonable tonight.
I think having multiple species present actually made it more curious than aggressive.
"Reasonable," Velthak repeated faintly. "You describe a 40-meter apex predator as reasonable. Why shouldn't I?"
It listened to explanations, asked relevant questions, and reached a rational conclusion based on available information.
That's the definition of reasonable behavior.
Zarahai stared at him, finally, understanding what she had been seeing all along. Lieutenant Marcus Webb wasn't pretending to be calm and competent, he genuinely was calm and competent. The kind of deep, unshakable confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and never having reason to doubt those capabilities. "The other species," she said slowly. "The ones who have tried to establish military installations without proper diplomatic protocols.
What happened to them?" Webb's expression became carefully neutral. "They learned that apex predators don't respond well to threats."
"Specifically?"
"The Hegemon Collective lost an entire garrison on Vega Prime.
The crystalline hegemony abandoned 3 mining operations after their security forces proved inadequate. The Vorathai Empire discovered that their battlecruisers were surprisingly vulnerable to coordinated attacks by flying predators."
"And humans?" "Humans have never lost a facility to predator attack."
"Because you negotiate instead of fighting?"
"Because we understand what we're dealing with," Webb corrected. "Every death world in the galaxy has apex predators.
Every apex predator species has evolved sophisticated intelligence and social behaviors. Most galactic civilizations try to impose their will through superior technology and military force. Humans try to establish diplomatic relationships with the dominant local intelligence.
Even when that intelligence happens to be in the form of a 40-meter killing machine?
Especially then. Intelligence is intelligence, regardless of the physical form it inhabits. Ambassador Thrixtal had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he spoke with obvious thoughtfulness.
"Lieutenant Webb, I find myself reconsidering many assumptions about human military doctrine."
"Such as?" "I had assumed that your species' reputation for peaceful diplomacy was a result of military weakness.
Now I'm wondering if it might represent the ultimate expression of military strength." Webb's smile was politely neutral. "I'm not qualified to discuss military philosophy, Ambassador.
I'm just a security escort who happens to be good at talking to dangerous wildlife."
But Zarahai saw the truth behind his modesty.
Humans weren't weak prey animals who had stumbled onto diplomatic success, they were apex social predators who had evolved the ability to form symbiotic relationships with any intelligent species, regardless of physical form or apparent threat level. They survived on death worlds not despite being human, but because being human meant never meeting a creature too dangerous to negotiate with. The negotiations concluded the following morning with agreements that surprised everyone involved. Each delegate found themselves more willing to consider compromise and cooperation, influenced perhaps by spending a night under the protection of apex predators who had chosen to trust human judgment about their character and intentions. As they prepared to depart, Zarahai found herself walking beside Lieutenant Webb toward the landing pad where their shuttle waited. "Lieutenant," she said carefully, "I have one final question."
"Yes, Your Highness?" "How many worlds like this one do humans control?"
Webb's pause was barely perceptible.
"Control is probably the wrong word, Your Highness.